After 9 years of this Liberal NDP Prime Minister, it doesn't feel like Canada anymore. Life is more unaffordable than ever. Canadians, the Governor of the Bank of Canada, even random Liberals are saying this government is not helpful. They're out of control spending and not worth the cost. Canadians are living in their cars and in tents because they can't afford housing. They're lining up at food banks in record numbers because they can't afford food, and leaving in droves because they can't afford the high cost of living. When will the Liberals implement a common sense plan and bring in a dollar for dollar law, cap government spending so inflation and interest rates can come down?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we have put forward a budget that invests in the things Canadians need. First and foremost, housing. And we're doing that by asking those at the very top to contribute a little bit more. And the good news, Mr. Speaker, is we are doing it in a fiscally responsible way. And you don't have to believe the partisans in any chair in this House. Talk to the analysts at Moody's, who last week reaffirmed Canada's AAA rating, the highest that exists, with a stable outlook. Doesn't get better than that, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Calgary Forest Lawn.
Speaker, common sense is chasing this finance minister. Just like in Alberta, she's speeding away from it. They've put taxpayers on the hook. $54 billion of taxpayer money is going to go to, just in interest to this Prime Minister's doubling of the debt. That means more money is going to bankers, bondholders, and this finance minister's Bay Street buddies than to doctors, nurses, and to the healthcare system. Why doesn't she pump on the brakes on the hypocrisy and let common sense catch up? Introduce a dollar for dollar law so inflation and interest rates can finally come down.
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, last week, Moody's reaffirmed our AAA credit rating. These are objective analysts who have pointed out that Canada has the most fiscally responsible plan in the G7.
The ones that gave the United States a AAA credit rating right before their economy crashed?
Conservative hypocrisy. Last week, Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader wrote an op-ed asking business leaders to attack our budget. I guess that's because he doesn't have the courage to come out and say the truth, which is he stands for those at the top, not regular Canadians.
The Honourable Member from Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Last week, the Governor of the Bank of Canada confirmed what millions of Canadians already know. Liberal spending is making life more expensive. 9 years of NDP Liberal deficits had led to a lost decade, lowering standards of living, record food bank usage, and a housing crisis. Will the government finally commit to a dollar-for-dollar rule that allow Canadians to feed their families and keep their homes?
Great job, Phil.
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I respect the member for Northumberland, and he is better than actually misrepresenting the words of the Governor of the Bank of Canada.
Oh, come on.
The reality is the Governor of the Bank of Canada, in testimony since the budget, has said, and I quote, "The budget does respect the fiscal guardrails that the government put in place." And I quote, that's what he said. And he said, quote, "Keeping the debt to GDP ratio on a declining track, and importantly, keeping the deficit below 1% of GDP in future years. The budget commits to those guardrails, and that is helpful."
The Honourable Member from Northumberland, Peterborough South.
I will quote the Governor directly. He said that this Liberal budget is not helpful. It's more distraction, more denial. In order to cover up their record of massive deficits, which has led to over $54 billion of interest being paid in this budget alone. We'll pay more in the GST. We'll collect more in the GST, or collect more here than in the GST in terms of interest. We will pay more in interest than we will in healthcare transfers. When will they finally get their deficits under control?
I don't think people
so the Canadians can eat and then keep their homes?
Like $54 billion a year in credit card interest is insane. That's
Mr.
insane.
Speaker, that is simply not true.
That is.
I encourage people to read the testimony of the Governor of the Bank of Canada and news reports about that testimony. Here is what he said, and I am quoting precisely.
That's what
keeping the debt to GDP ratio on a declining track, and importantly, keeping deficits below 1% of GDP in future years. The budget also commits to those guardrails going forward, and that is helpful. Those are the words of the governor. People can just take a look at the transcript, Mr. Speaker.
Then I have Deputy.
So your commitments going
Honourable
forward
Member for
that you always break.
Mr. Speaker, Quebecers are struggling. Mortgage renewals are hurting them. Mortgage rates are high.
Good question, Veronica.
Due in part
Good
to
question.
the chaotic management of public finances by this Prime Minister and the Bloc. Over the past 9 years, more than $500 billion in additional spending has been voted in by the Liberals and supported by the Bloc. That includes $115 billion in June 2022 for pipelines. And yes, the so-called Green Bloc voted for a pipeline. Will the Liberals and the Bloc take responsibility for the high cost of mortgages and of living? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, Canadians hear one party that has no ambition, no vision, and no plan. Mr. Speaker, Canadians have a choice to make. They have a choice to listen to a party that has no vision or a government that's investing in youth, in growth, in housing, in science, and in research. Mr. Speaker, here on this side of the House, we will continue to invest in Canadians because countries that have confidence invest in their people, and that's precisely what we'll do. The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Party has a lot of vision and common sense, unlike the government opposite, which seems to have lost sight of that. The Bloc is doing no better than the Liberals. The Bloc supported $500 billion in extra spending. They've always voted against the budget, but they do vote for all of the budgetary appropriations. And that's why Quebecers and Canadians are struggling. Will the government ask the Bloc why they're always supporting them in their nonsensical programs? Mr. Speaker, Canadians watching understand that that's not common sense. It's nonsense in 2024 to have no ambition for the country, no vision, no plan for the country at a time when we're in a full economic transition. People watching at home understand we're investing in science and research. We're investing in the next generation. We're investing in
Freeland's
growth.
gonna bobble
It's
her head.
the time for that. That's what we're doing.
I knew it.
Time to invest. We're a confident nation.
She's gonna
and
bobble
we
her
will
head.
build